A while back, I found an old table saw and joiner under the crawl space of my house, so I pulled it out to have a look and thought it might be a fun project to try to get working again. I started by soaking most of the internal parts, nuts, bolts, etc. in penetrating fluid. I did this multiple times over the course of a few days while the saw sat out in my driveway. After it looked like the penetrating fluid had done as much as it could do, I pulled the saw off the frame and brought it in. I pulled it apart and set the motor aside. I took off the outer housing to get to the chassis and separate it from the tabletop. The arbor and both adjustment wheels were seized, and I was worried that this project might be a bad idea. So I applied more penetrating fluid to everything inside and waited a few more days, meanwhile moving on to the housing. After about 20 minutes with the wire wheel, the housing was looking pretty cool and had a lot of character. Even though it is fairly thin sheet metal, structurally it was still sound. I was then resolved to really get this thing to work. The tabletop cleaned up well also. I was careful to get it back to smooth without removing the discoloration from the years of rust. Luckily, the top wasn't pitted from deep oxidation, as you might expect from something left sitting for this long. Next, it was time to clean up the chassis and arbor swing arm. If anything was going to derail this project, it would be a problem with one of these two critical pieces. So I started on these first. I was able to remove all the drift pins and get every piece out and cleaned up. The bearings for the arbor are press fit into the swing arm, so removing them took a bit of patience. Both bearings were easily serviced by removing a seal from one side and cleaning it thoroughly, then repacking with new grease. After reassembling the arbor and swing arm, the arbor appeared to spin true and be in good shape. I took this moment to add a lock-off to the arbor pulley. I drilled 2 holes in the arbor pulley to accept a standard angle grinder wrench. Knowing that the arbor was in at least decent shape, the next critical component was the trunnions. The trunnions on this saw mount to the underside of the table. The trunnion guide plates that mount to the chassis were held in place by 1032 screws threaded into the chassis itself. It felt like the chassis metal was too soft to be able to properly torque the screws, so I drilled the holes out to accept a 1/4-20 cap head screw and nuts on the backside. The original rear trunnion tensioner was sheared off. This was also threaded at 1032, and was definitely not adequate for a part that holds the whole assembly in place, not to mention the weight of the motor hanging off the backside. I re-drilled and tapped the hole to 1/4-20 thread, and it feels very secure now. Not shown in this video is lots of sanding, media blasting, and cleaning to get everything back to a usable state. All along the way I replaced every piece of standard hardware with a new stainless piece, unless there was aesthetic value in cleaning up and using the original. The reassembly was very easy and felt rewarding to say the least. Next was the motor rebuild, which I ended up making a separate video for, which you'll find linked in the description. Long story short, it was in really bad shape, but with some patience, research, and help from a few people, I was able to get it working again. This motor definitely wasn't the original. Based on what I could find online, this motor actually predates the saw. As soon as I remounted the motor and installed the belt, it was clear the motor was too heavy. It was pulling hard on the arbor pulley, and raising the blade was very difficult. The extra weight of the motor is also likely the cause of the rear trunnion tensioner shearing off. To solve this, I picked up 2 5-pound springs from my local Ace Hardware. The motor feels to be about 50 pounds, and without doing a bunch of math, it feels like they dropped the tension to the arbor by maybe 30 or 40%. Exactly what I was hoping for. The motor and blade spun up beautifully. Now the moment of truth. Time to check the blade runout. If you don't know what runout is, it's the amount of deviation from quote-unquote perfect in the rotation of the saw blade, either vertically or side to side. I don't own a fancy machinist style indicator, but it's not hard to get an idea of how much runout you have. You can hear the point where the blade is rubbing the Allen wrench. There's at least some small horizontal deviation. Here's another angle. Vertical runout looks great, but I wanted to make sure that the horizontal deviation was from the arbor itself and not the blade. I marked the blade very carefully with a marker. Then rotated the blade in relation to the arbor 180 degrees. As you can see, the blade started rubbing on the opposite side, confirming that the arbor indeed isn't perfectly true. Time to get out the feeler gauges. I think that a deviation of plus or minus 2.5 thousandths of an inch is very acceptable, especially for any carpentry work that I'll ever do. And also not bad for a 70-year-old saw. Time to make a stand. I used some angle iron and welded bolts into the corners to fit the base. After some precise measuring, I thought that the legs would look good coming out diagonally at a 15-degree angle. Looks pretty good. Time to add braces and a power switch. I found a double pull switch on Amazon. It's got a very satisfying clunk when you press it. I also found a miter gauge on eBay that seemed to match nicely. The first attempt at a cut didn't go well. The saw couldn't even rip cut a small piece of 1/4-inch plywood. I did a little math to figure out the amount of torque at the arbor pulley. While the RPM was good, the motor just didn't have enough horsepower. As luck would have it, a few days later, I found a free vintage table saw on Facebook Marketplace. It happened to have a 3/4 horse, 3,500 RPM motor on it too. The saw itself was beyond salvaging. I mounted it up and changed the pulley configuration a bit. The original configuration only had about 3/4 foot-pounds of torque at the arbor pulley. After the motor and pulley change, I think I'm squeezing another 1/2 foot-pound of torque out of this thing at the arbor pulley. Keep in mind, modern saws usually have a 2 to 5 horsepower motor on them. I figured as a minimum I'd want to be able to rip cut a 2x4. As you can see, the saw will do it just fine as long as I go slow. It might go faster if I put a different blade on it. But also, as you can see, the motor will stall if I feed it too quickly. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how this project turned out. It was fun. Thanks for watching.